Welcome back. If you haven't had a chance to go through a tutorial video, you're more than welcome to, because we're going to dive deep in creating the time recorder add-on in this video. This is going to be a longer session than the other videos have been because we're going to be explaining each of the nodes as we go. We're going to be making a time recorder that will record the entire project time, along with a session timer that will track each session's time, and every time you open up your Blender session, we'll move that time into a previous session time to help you keep track of each session and shoot for milestones. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Alright, jumping right into developing our add-on. Step one when you're making your add-on is to set up the UI and blockout structure of your operators and functions. Just like on your modeling stages, you make a blockout and then you refine your blockout with additional steps. We can apply that to our programming as well. So on our main time recorder graph, what we will do is we will set up the main panel UI. And click on the Add button here and go to Interface. And the interface contains all of the UI interface options except for icons. And we want a panel. And you can zoom in with the middle mouse wheel scrolling up. We want our panel to exist on the Properties panel under Scene because we want the timer to be attached to the scene itself. So in here we can click on the eyedropper icon, click on Scene Only. So now that we've got that set, notice how it says Properties window now. Drag out from our panel, and this is a yellow diamond, meaning it's going to be containing interface data, and it flows from left to right when you see a diamond icon. If you drag out, you can hold Shift, and on Interface, we're going to add in a label. Now, if the Shift method doesn't work, you can just come up to your Add menu and click on Interface, and they're all here as well. So on the label, we know that we're wanting to keep track of the total time. So we can come up here and type in total time for our label. And this is a string, so it will show the string. And we can hit compile now, or Shift R to compile. And we have a new panel called total time. Now, new panel is not very appropriate for our add-on, so we'll go ahead and change that now to time recorder. And you compile again, and you'll notice the header of the panel has been changed. You can also add in a header node. So we can grab this and Shift D to duplicate it to bring it down and add information here. We can say total time. We can replace it with time recorder. When you compile, you'll notice you have a header that's built in to the header as well. You have a main label and then a header label. And what's nice about this is you may not want text, but you can add an icon. So Shift and drag out from here. And you'll notice that on the input section, there's an icon node. And we can just quickly add in a clock on the search menu, or how about time? And when we compile now, notice you have an icon associated with your header label. You don't even need any text. That's pretty cool, right? So we can take the header, and you can continue adding more items to the header as well, but this is sufficient for our simple add-on. Now we've got a label for total time, but we don't actually have any placeholder for total time. And we want a separate line for that, so you can add in on your panel. We'll just make a placeholder for the blockout of our UI. And we'll say placeholder for total time. Compile again. And it's updating. Look at that. This is getting addicting now. We can Shift D to duplicate both of these and bring them down together. And as you add in another panel, you get more options to continue adding. Now let's say I drew this one actually to here on accident. And I wanted to increase a panel above here. On the Serpens options, you can click on Show Insert Icons. And you can click on the up arrow and it will add in another socket above. So Shift R to compile. Notice how we've duplicated the label. So instead of total time, we want to keep track of session time for each Blender session as well. And it would be kind of nice to be able to also show what the previous session was. So we'll duplicate this one more time. And there we go. We've got a total time, its placeholder, session time, its placeholder, and previous time, and its placeholder. And this looks good, but it is kind of boring. Well, that's part of the blockout, just proving concept. So we have a UI now associated with our add-on, but we need to be able to fill out this information. Well, we definitely want to be making sure that we're getting time, so we're going to want some sort of function that will grab the time. We want to be able to tell our add-on when we want to grab the time. We got a couple of options to do that. We can go ahead and on the bottom of our panel section, you can Shift A to add, and we're going to look for events. On a certain event, we want to start the collection of time and we want to end the collection of time. So on load is a great event. And when a Blender session loads, if the Blender session is active, you can click on before and it will create the event when you go to file and open a file. If you're starting up Blender for the first time, the before doesn't seem to run, so after will. And we want this to happen when we open Blender, when we open a file, after will run after all of those. And we've got a gray diamond icon. So we want an event to happen and we want to be able to run code. Well, we're going to be placing our code inside of functions. We'll call the function using what's called a run function node. Add menu, come over to functions, and there's a run function. And we'll add functions onto another graph. We might as well make the blockout now. So connect that in, so programmatically when we have onload event, we'll go and ask for a function to run. While we're here, we'll go ahead and add another event, and we'll say onSave. So every time we save, we will also go and grab our time and end the time collection. And you can Shift E to duplicate the run function and connect it in. We can run this event before, since we'll already be open in our session. Now we've got two run function nodes, but we don't actually have any functions defined in Serpens. We can go ahead and make a function now. Click on your plus button, and we'll assign these functions to a graph. I like to label my graphs with what's going to be in them, so we will start tracking our time, and we can make another graph to end tracking our time. And inside of here, you can Shift A to add, and under functions, we have a function node. And just make sure your name doesn't equal the name of the graph, because when you compile it, it's not going to know the difference between the two. So I just give it a similar name without the dash. And we can do the same thing for our end tracking. So now that we have our functions made, you can assign the onload to run start tracking and the onsave to run the end tracking. And since this is still a blockout, we don't have anything going on inside the function, and that's okay for right now. Now when we start tracking, we want to be able to grab the time. And so we need code that will also grab time. And we're going to want to grab that time on end tracking as well. So rather than duplicating the work, we can make another function to get the time. So on getTime node, we'll add in our function. And because we want to return values out of this function, there is a node for that. You drag out from your socket, and if you have the shift method turned on, you have a function return node. You can input data through parameters, and you can output data through the return, and that is assigned to this function. Now we want to grab the current time, and there is an input node for that. Think of input nodes as nodes that provide you data into other nodes or into the program itself. And inside the input nodes, we have Boolean inputs, float inputs, integer inputs. We also have current time. And you can express the time to something as a string, the date to something as a string, or you can express it in integer form. And we want to express all of this in a vector. And there's a nice way to combine all three of these and output them into a vector 3. And you can do that using a converter combine vector node. And it'll allow you to combine different types of data for vectors. We want to combine in the integer to match our data type. The hours will go in X, we'll throw in minutes in Y, and seconds for Z, and we can output that over to our get time. And notice how when I drag and connected, it assumes that we want to use an integer for our data returning, and it gives it a name based on what it knows about the input data. We're going to call this time instead, and I want to say it's a vector 3 since it's got 3 values built into it, and we're going to say that the 3 values are hours, minutes, and seconds. That helps me keep track of what's coming out of this function. And we can also do year, month, and day, and we'll return that as well. Copy this, Control V to paste, and we're just going to call this date. And now we got a function that's actually doing something. So we can get the time and export it in a vector3 format. I also want to just export out the minutes. If I just export minutes, that's just minutes within this hour. And I want to express the total number of minutes by the time. Now if you click the plus value, you'll notice your socket changes gray. It's going to accept any kind of data. Well, I still want this to be an integer. So I'll hit minus. This is a great time to be able to use portals because our graph is going to get really messy without them. And what portals do is they allow you to take your data into a node and it'll output to another node that holds the same data. So what we can do is we can just output from our time here and hit Shift A, go to Special and Portal Node. And I like to label my portal nodes under the node menu. Time vector3. And since I've dragged this to here, it knows that the data type is an integer. Drag this out so I know what it is. And I can click on this and it will output my portal to that as well. Now I'm going to label my output real quick. I can just come in here and copy. Paste that in. Labeling your portals is handy so you don't lose track of what portals are doing what. And what's nice about this is you can continue outputting this portal to another location and it's still storing the data. And I want to be able to split this vector back up now. So Shift A, converter, and this time we'll split the vector. Because I just want to grab the hours and minutes and then do math on them. Take this to an integer form. And we can do math. Rather than the Shift A method, we're going to go to logic and math. And the input on this is blue, but it will accept integers and float values. So we want to take in the hours, and we're going to multiply it by 60, and then add that result to the minutes. So we'll have a total minutes for the day. Before we do that, since I'm already on add, I might as well Shift E to duplicate this. And we'll drag this up just a little bit, throw the Y onto the B location. Now we can change this to multiply. So hours multiplied by 60, there are 60 minutes in an hour. We can output that result and add those minutes to the minutes within this hour. And then we can export that integer result to the minutes. Time expressed in minutes. And there we go. We got our first graph sending in an input of current time, and we're outputting from the function the time is a vector3, the date is a vector3, and the time expressed in minutes. On our Serpens tab, we have, for our start tracking, we can call in the get time. So drag out functions, and we're going to run a function. And once your function has a return, you'll get another input section here where you can click on function return, and now you can return the data. We want to store this data into a property, and we have a property for, we'll set one for date, we'll set one for time, and we'll set one for the opened or saved time expressed in minutes. So let's go to our properties panel here, click on the plus icon, and we want this property attached to a specific data type, and for us we want that to be a blend data of the scene. Now if you have more than one scene, then each scene will hold this property. And all properties, when you add them, default to a string data type. We can change that to integer here, and we can double click and change the name. So we'll call this one time. I like to label what it has in it, vector3 in hours, minutes, and seconds. And we have an integer, but in order to make it a vector, we have to click on the checkbox. And I do want it as a size of 3, and we'll set the minimum value of 0. A soft minimum will allow you, when you drag a slider, it won't let you go negative. We can go ahead and set that as well. It's not going to show up here, but when you show it to your user, if we decided to make a property that did that, they wouldn't be able to slide it below the 0 value, but they could type in a negative number and it would take it. Now I don't need that for this one, just showing how it would work. So we've got our time property, and now we're going to also make date property. Do this in year, month, and day. Same thing, we want an integer. Set the minimum of 0. And we do want it attached to the scene as opposed to attaching it to something like a light or a curve or a mesh. And it defaults to scene, so that makes it easy. Now, because we have it attached to a scene, we have to tell it which scene we want to be able to set or get data from. And now's a good time to do that. So on time, we can set data on this. And when you set data, you're changing the value of the property. And you need to do that with an execute diamond node. When you're getting the data, you don't need to execute anything. You're just pulling out from the stored location in memory. Now notice how we have a teal scene socket. We need to be able to grab from that. Shift A, and we have under input scene context. We want to grab the active scene. Now this is a big node. We don't need all of these things to be displayed. We just want that one. And if you hit Control H after you've connected your socket, you can minimize this. You can even minimize it further if you'd like to get it out of the way. And we're going to drag this time data from our getTime function and store it into the time. Now we do want to state what exactly is the time that we're saving in. We're calling this the opened or saved time, because that's where we're going to be setting the value. And the same thing for the date. When you're specific with your properties, you know exactly how they're storing your data. And notice when I change the name of the property, it updated on my node. Some nodes will update and some nodes will not. Operators won't update when you change their name. You can go in and reconnect them, but that's not a big deal. We'll get to that. Now we've got this set. We're going to have to set in the date as well. So click on the setter, and we can come in and grab the date. And notice how our graph is getting a little bit messy. Now I could drag from here and set up from one input to multiple nodes. Make sure we connect our execute socket. But I do want to use the same thing that I used in the previous graphs. We'll make a portal. Do Shift A here. Come over to portal node. And we're going to be using the scene context as an input for a portal a lot. So when I click on node, rename it real quick, and we can just call it in scene. And when I output now, quickly set that name as well. You can copy and keep these over here. That may not seem to help very much in this graph, but now that we have this structure, we can minimize. And notice how it keeps a slightly colored outline. And we'll be duplicating this a lot. So now at least we have it made. That'll help us as we go down the road. Now we do want to grab in the time as well. So we can grab all these nodes and shift them up just a little bit. And we're going to be making another property. We'll call it opened or saved. Oh, we want saved here as well. This one's going to be expressed in minutes. Set our data type to integer. We don't want to make a vector this time. We will set a minimum of 0. And we'll throw in a setter as well. And we can come here and duplicate these out. That's what's nice about portals. Now when we've started tracking, we will be storing this data into these 3 variables. When we end tracking, we want to continue to compare against these variables as well. And for this function, we're done. On end tracking, it will get a little bit more cumbersome. So when we end tracking, we want to also get the time. And when we save the file, we're going to be calling the end tracking. Grab the getTime node and return the time. And we're going to store this into another property. And we'll state that it's the current time. And we only need this in expression of minutes. So I'm not going to set a vector 3 for this. Set a minimum. and we will set the current time. Now notice we need to attach the scene. Every time we add a property that has an attached to, we need to attach it to its blend data. Well, in our start tracking, we've already made these two nodes, so you can Control C to copy them to clipboard. On end tracking, you can Control V and paste them to the clipboard. And notice how the color has changed, which is nice. This is how Serpens is keeping track of the portals based upon their color. I can click and copy that, and I just do need to quickly rename the output for scene. The more portals you add, the more you're going to probably get confused by which one is doing what, so the label really helps. Okay, so we've set in our current time, and actually, no, we'll just drag this here. There we go, that's pretty. Now that we have a current time, we can calculate a delta between the opened or previous saved time and our time now. We can do some math with that and then output that data and put it into the total time. We can drag out, and actually we need another variable first. So we'll make another variable called total time. And this is one we'll be displaying to our users. Set the minimum to 0 and provide a setter. Shift D to duplicate the output. I'll drag this over here for now. And we're going to calculate the total time based upon the delta. So you can do Shift A and go over to your logic math node. And we want to subtract the current time from our opened or saved time. So we can get the values by clicking here and hitting the getter button. And we just want to get the property. There's options to be able to interface the property, let the user interact with it, or execute code when the value updates. Right now we're just wanting to get the value. So we're not setting any value into the input side, we're pulling value from the output side of the node. And we do need to make sure we attach our scene from the portal output. And we're going to subtract. A is going to be subtracted from B. So the higher value will be subtracted from the lower value. And we're going to be subtracting out the opened or saved time. If you have a portal and there are two nodes that are close together, they're both using the same input, you can drag out from the same output to two different input nodes. We have an integer result that we'll be storing into the total time, but we also want this delta time to be used on the session time. And we need to make a property for that first, but we can make a portal to drag out and use this data in other locations. So Shift A, go to Special Portal. We have a green portal this time, and we'll state in delta time minutes. And we'll do the same thing. Look how clean things look when you're making use of your portals. You don't have to drag across and get all confused with your nodes because the noodles are making use of the best structure. And you can make your graphs condense down for easier reading. So if I just output the delta for total time, all it's going to be doing is keeping track of the delta itself, and I want to add to the previous value of total time. So we'll make another math node, drag it in here, and when I drag it between a noodle that's already connected, notice how it inserts itself in the middle. Now it assumes what socket you want to input into, so just move the socket to somewhere else. Sometimes it doesn't do a great job. It may send data into an execute socket instead. But in this case, the math node doesn't have any execute sockets, so it chose slot A. We're going to add our delta time to the total time that was there before. We can get the data on the property for total time. And we don't want a float result, we want the integer result. Shift D and call out our scene. And now we've got the total time being added from what its previous value was with the delta time between saves. Now for our session time, we need to make another variable. Change our data type to integer, set the minimum value. We want to set the property. We're going to be following a very similar structure with this math node. So we can grab all of this, Shift D, drag it over, and just change a couple of things. I don't want to grab the total time, so I'll hit X to delete that. I do want the delta time, but every time we open a blend session, I want to start out with a 0 value. And properties will exist between blend sessions. They're stored with the file, and they're stored in the scene values. I want a variable that will reset its value every time we open Blender, and so there are variables that we can do that with. And I'll just call this variable temp session time. And variables don't have as much that you need to attach information to on them because they exist within the node graph itself. Now if I click on get time, you'll notice that variable no longer shows up. It is context sensitive, and it has scope within the end tracking graph. It will be out of scope if it goes into any other graph because it won't know what exactly this is. It hasn't been defined. We're going to change its data type to integer, and it has a default value of 0. Now we don't have any other options to set minimums and maximums because we're just using this to temporarily store data, and on the next Blender session, its data will be reset back to 0 or back to whatever its default value is. So I want to get the value of it at the beginning of a blend session. It should be the default value of 0. So when we first end tracking, this will be 0. And I don't need this output for the scene from that portal because variables don't need to be tied to a scene. They're tied to the graph itself. Drag that out just a little bit to get the name. And then we don't want to store that into session time yet. We want to store this information back into the variable itself. And what that does is it does the same thing that we're doing with total time, only every time we open a blend value, we're getting the value of 0, adding the delta, and setting it into this temp, set its value into the session time property. Now we'll get that data. And let's grab our scene portal output, throw it on our session time. Now we've got a pretty handy node graph, and it's not that complex thanks to the portals. Now there is a caveat here, and what ends up happening is when you open a blend file, we'll go to the time recorder itself. You're going to start tracking, but the data itself may not have a loaded or saved time when you install the add-on. It will throw the data onto the opened or saved time when you load a file, but if your user is installing the add-on for the first time, you're not loading anything, you're loading the add-on. There isn't a node for that. So in order to work around that, you have to come into your end tracking and compare your opened or saved time property, and you compare that to whether it's a 0 or not. And if it's 0, we need to set it. So right after we set our current time, let's go ahead and drag out and grab all these. Slide them over just a touch. And we want an if statement here that says if the opened or saved time is 0, then let's set it to whatever the current time is. So we'll get its property value and Shift A to add. And under program, we have an if else program. We drag it in between, it will connect itself. And we have a condition here. We want to compare opened or saved time to 0. So we'll grab our output scene, tie that into our property, and then we want an input, an integer value of 0. And we can compare these, drag these over just a bit, Shift A, and we have logic. And we have a compare node. And basically, if open or save time is equal to 0, we can drag in our Boolean here and it will output a condition of true. Now, if it's not equal to 0, it will output a condition of false. And the if-else program has 3 execute sockets. Continue will happen after the program runs, but true will happen if the input condition Boolean data socket is held to a true state or a value of 1. The false will run if the value is 0. So we want a value of 1. We'll output a true, and so we'll make use of this true. And we're just going to set that variable. Let's move our scene context back over, get it out of the way, and we'll give ourselves just a little bit more room. So we've gotten the data, now we want to set the data. Attach in our scene. And we'll set the current time for the open time when we install the add-on and click Save. Because both of these are using the same scene. Now if it's false, we don't need to do anything because it'll already have a value for the opened or saved time, so we can just continue on with our code. So when this comes through and is true, we'll execute on the true here, and then we'll continue on and set all of our data. And the math will happen when these two are equal, because we just set them equal. This will be 0. So total time will be updated to 0, session time will be updated to 0. We should be good to go. So this graph is a little bit more complex, but it's still not that bad. We have good flow. Now we can make use of these in our time recorder itself. But we're not displaying anything because we have our blocked out placeholders. So we can now display the labeled values. So we have a placeholder here, a placeholder here, and a placeholder here. And we're going to put this on a string. So under the total time, we will get that property. I'll just set it here for now. And we want to grab in our active scene. And notice when I pasted, it was way out here. Sometimes when you paste, not everything is in the same location. What you can do if you want all your graphs to be in the same location, we know that this existed over here. So we could grab all these nodes. You can first hit the period key on your numpad, and it will tell you where your stuff is that you added as long as they're selected. And grab all this in and drag it over to be roughly in the same location. That way when you copy and paste from your next graphs, maybe you'll paste closer. All right, we'll get these out of the way over here. And then we need the output from our scene. Notice how we have a changed input portal color because we're on a different graph. Relabel our output real quick. We'll probably be using this a lot more. We have total time we need to populate, and we also have session time we need to populate. And if I just throw this onto the placeholder for total time, we're only going to be seeing the integer value. But let's hit Shift-R and compile. So notice how they're both set to 0. And when we're compiling, we're not running these events. We're defaulting values to 0. Now this is good, but what if I wanted to state 0 MIN and 0 MIN to the user so he knows what the value actually means? We can do that. We have a combine strings node. So we're just going to slide these over just a little bit more. And Shift A, logic, combine strings. Notice how we exported an integer and went right into a string? Serpens is converting that for us to a string data. This is the power of Serpens, is it does a lot of the work for you. We'll combine the strings from the total time, the integer value, and then we'll add in another string. And we just want to give a space, type in the word min for minutes. Now when I compile, that's a lot more pretty to the user's eye. We want the user experience to be good when we're making add-ons, not make our users confused about what they're looking at. So we can do the same thing here. Oops. I put it on the bottom. That's okay. It keeps track of the value. I can put it on the top. And now I can compile. And we've got a total time and a session time that's being recorded. We also have a previous session time that we want to keep track of. So how are we going to handle the previous session time? When we first load the scene, we can take in the session time that we had stored and store it into the previous session time variable before it gets reset. So we can do a new variable or new property. Set our data type to integer, set the minimum value, and then we're going to set the previous session time. Duplicate over our portal output. And we will get the session time on load that was stored in the scene before it gets reset during the end tracking. Now that we have that property, we can employ its placeholder as well. Shift D, bring this down. Shift D, bring that down. Grab our getter property. Drag these over. Now I've got all of my nodes tied to the grid using the snapping. We can bring in our UI just a little bit more now. So it's not the world's prettiest UI. You can always collapse these down if you want. I'm going to leave them open just so I can see what they're doing. Just a little bit, and I'll cover that. Okay, I think we're ready to hit compile, and we have another line expressing all of our times. And we've only got it on 4 different graphs. The reason why you want each graph for this is the fewer your nodes that you have on a graph, the quicker that you compile. And on your settings, you'll notice our compile time is fast. If I added all of these nodes onto one graph, it would start slowing down the compile time. Now, if you want to center all of your graphs, you can drag out, select them all, and hit period on the numpad. The zoom is common between all the graphs, but the location is not. It's unique. Now that we've got our add-on working, when I save, these times should be updating. We can go ahead and test in the add-on and export it. And we'll just export version 0. So click on Save Add-on. We'll export it to the desktop. And We'll overwrite this one here. You'll get a pop-up once you save. If you don't click, it will leave quickly if you click away. But this will allow you to, if you're satisfied with your add-on, you can upload the blend file to the Serpens marketplace, and you can post in the Discord that you've created a new add-on, and it will send it to the Discord as a confirmation that your add-on has been added to the marketplace. You could also use an external link. You get one more step where you have your links and you enter your price. So if you're putting this on Gumroad, you can upload the blend file for other developers to take a look at your node graph, like here. This is all saved in the blend file. So if I want to be able to open this up, all I have to do is save my blend file and open the blend file, and I'd have my time recorder add-on graphs. Now we're going to close this down now that we've exported the add-on, and we'll install the add-on in a fresh session of Blender. And I'll see you back in just a minute. Opening up a new session of Blender after closing down our add-on, go to Edit Preferences and install our add-on. And make sure you're clicked onto the Scenes workspace. You should see your times load into the Scene Properties panel. Make sure you save your preferences. And we'll give it just a minute. I'll pause the video and come back and see if these times update. Save our file. I'm just going to save it as untitled. And click on your object. You'll notice that the time is now updated. Now, checking the previous session time, we'll have to close the file down and reopen it. And when we save again, we should move session time into previous session time and clear out the session time. So I'll just save again real quick and close Blender down and open Blender back up. Load our untitled scene. And if I save now, should see that we've moved the session time into previous session time when the file loaded. And now the new session time has updated itself. Now it's going to be off a little bit because it's rounding. But we've proved the concept that total time is continuing to count up, session time has reset down, and previous session time has been moved from the previous session. We can save this again. You have to click on your object to see it update. So let's go ahead and add some icons into the add-on itself. So we'll close this back down, but first let's uninstall our add-on. So in Edit Preferences, and we'll search for the add-on itself, uncheck the box, and remove it. Now those scene properties are still there, even though the add-on's been removed. Save Preferences and close this file down. We'll open up our time recorder add-on now. Back in our time recorder add-on main graph, we're going to go ahead and add in some custom icons. As you can see here in the custom icon section, I'll have these all posted into the Gumroad page, and I'll have a link to that page on the YouTube description. We'll go ahead and delete these out though. I want to place one of those icons here on the time recorder header, and the other three within the time recorder representing each of the times. We'll go ahead and start with the header first. Click on the plus button. You can type in gray icon or gray clock. Blue one for total time. Another one for session time. And another one for previous time. Now you have just the exclamation point symbol now. So in order to add in your custom icon, you click on the open button. Double click on your icon and watch it load. Now this image is 32 by 32 in pixels, and you don't want to put too much detail in these because they won't show through. You want to keep your icons simple. Total time, load that in. We'll load in the session time. We'll load in the previous time. And we can click on the getter. It'll create an icon node for us with the custom already selected and the icon name already selected. You don't have to do that. You can always click on custom yourself. and click on the icon that way. We'll Shift R to compile, and we've got our time recorder header built now. Separate each of these, give ourselves a little bit more room, and we'll click on the getter for the total time. And I can just Shift E and duplicate down, change to session time, do the same thing for the previous time. Now we'll compile, and look at that. Doesn't that look beautiful? That's it for this video, really. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and cover how to create a debugger section so you can debug your add-on, and you can have it hidden from your users so that when the add-on is deployed, it doesn't show up. But it'll help you as you're building your add-on to debug certain parts that may not be working the way you thought they would, or maybe they need an extra feature. And I'll also help you combine all of the UI that we're going to be putting in the debugger, because we want to keep this in the debugger as well. And we can make this into an interface function. This is mainly to teach you about interface functions. They're a lot like a function, only you use them on UI elements. I'll also teach you how to make a add to menu, and maybe we'll add in the total time up at the top of the header for the 3D view. Teach you how to do that in the next video as well. So stay tuned and look forward to seeing you all in the next one.